feed into this particular point. So the webinar is going to commence shortly. We've got a little bit of housekeeping to go through now. Hopefully we'll be able to set all microphones to mute, but if you do find that your microphone is is open, please do put it to mute. We're really keen to go and get some feedback and to kickstart discussions. There will be chances for Q&A through our particular agenda, but if you've got any comments or questions, please do make them through the chat, and we'll be able to feed them through at the appropriate junctures. So the webinar will be recorded, and we're going to be putting that up onto the YouTube channel. So please don't turn on your video if you don't want your likeness to be recorded and shared. Similarly, the same for audio. If you submit a question via the chat function, then we may have someone else voice your question for wider consumption. Hopefully that's okay with your consent. The slides will be made available. We'll put them up on the website and circulate a link to all attendees at the end of this session. And if there's any other sort of further information that you want to know about open networks, or if you've got any general feedback, please do get in touch with us at opennetworks@energynetworks.org. Good. I think on to the today's agenda. Then got a little bit from me now just to set the scene in context about the flexibility consultation, and then we've got a great set of deep dive spotlights on a number of the products within open networks. Be able to see a little bit more about some of the work that we've been undertaking in terms of the various different elements that help support flexibility within the industry, looking at the procurement processes, some of the underlying technical methodologies, and looking at how we're presenting that. Again, these deep dives will be punctuated by sessions for Q&A, and we've also got a little bit of a break schedule in there. And then as we close towards 4 o'clock today, then we'll be setting out a little bit more about the next steps, what we'll be looking to achieve, and the follow-ons from this kind of interaction. Excellent. Again, if there's any sort of comments or queries, please do chuck them into the chat. But the next introductory session is really to go and give you a little bit of a background of the Energy Networks Association, what we do, who we represent, and the various different member organisations that are represented by the ENA. So we really are the voice of the networks. That's our key aim as part of the Energy Networks Association. And we represent all of the electricity and gas customers within the UK. That means that we are responsible for delivering gas and electricity across those networks, across the many different miles of electricity and gas infrastructure that we've got within the UK. And there's a huge amount going on in order to keep the lights on and to keep your homes warm. We invest between the sort of 8-year period in 2025 through to 2023. Then there's around about £60 billion worth of investment going in there to help support those sort of networks. And it's really key that we do so in conjunction with understanding what the main aims of our stakeholders are. And this is just one of the series of events that we do in order to make sure that we're doing the right things for our customers. And they're conducted by both member organisations and the ENA as a group. The open networks is something that is has been a number of been building across a number of years. So we're now in our 5th year of this particular programme, and it supports the whole of Great Britain. The networks in the industry to be able to facilitate the transition to a smart and flexible energy system. And this is one of the key enablers that we see as the networks companies in terms of enabling net zero, which is something that is really at the heart of all of our businesses right at the moment. And particularly, we can see the growing importance of doing so with huge government targets to be able to hit net zero by 2050. We've got a lot of work to do between now and then in order to enable that transition. So working with Ofgem and BEIS, then they have published the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan. That's now in its second iteration. And that drives a number of key changes that we're expecting to see across the whole energy system, but particularly looking at how the networks are responding to be delivering those types of changes. And that's one of the things that we're most focused on within open networks, is delivering the right changes in order to drive forward some of the requirements that will be enable us to go and get to net zero. And open networks will be delivering many of the duties that are outlined in that Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan. So in terms of the programme itself and the consultation wrapper, then we are now seeking views across a number of our products about how your feedback can be incorporated into that. So this overarching flexibility consultation wrapper will cover both our overarching common frameworks. This is our kind of P0 product that looks at providing a draft of the framework and the roadmap, but it also dives down into a number of the different products as well, about how we can reconcile some of the key roles that the government and regulator is discharging across network operators, and making sure that we've got these key foundations to ensure that we are making the energy network as smart and as flexible as possible. And then there's some key publication informations that we think will help our stakeholders and customers better understand their roles and responsibilities within this transition. So whether that's the carbon reporting or the active network management, curtailment information, these are key reports and information that will be going out to that kind of wider stakeholders to feed into this particular process. So as part of the consultation, what we're trying to do is seek views from our stakeholders on the flexibility developments to date, captured in that previous slide, all the different products that we've completed, and also looking at the planned future developments so that we can update and adapt our work accordingly. What we're really trying to do is sort of move away from a very static picture of what we're doing across the year into something that's a bit more agile, recognising that the needs of our stakeholders may change through the year, and we're really looking to try and embed that into a framework. And this is one of the big changes that we're making, is going from a more static programme to something that's a bit more agile. And we're really trying to engage with our stakeholders as widely as possible to make sure that we're capturing those views and then we're building that into the programme. So we'll be able to, through this process, you'll be able to provide feedback on the content of our work today and help inform those future products that we're going to be taking forward. So everyone's welcome to respond, and we really are eagerly seeking this feedback, because it will help us better define what our products cover and how we prioritise them out into the future. So the next session here was as our first deep dive into the overarching framework and flexibility and pre-procurement. And this is the P0 product that I can now take you through the next few slides to explain our approach. So within the overarching common framework for flexibility, then it very much builds upon the insight from the regulator and from BEIS about how their expectation of how the whole energy system will be changing and will be developing. And this has been one of the key focuses for open networks over the past 5 years. And what we are doing within this overarching common framework is setting out how we take those Ofgem baseline expectations and the information and expectations from the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan, and how they're layered upon the previous work within open networks, which has been very much a bedrock for enabling flexibility and ensuring that we've got a smart system. And looking at the DSO implementation plan that is part of open networks delivery as well. And then we're building this into this common framework for flexibility, so it will be able to explain how we're taking forward a number of those objectives and outcomes, and how the products and the work that we're doing as an industry under open networks is delivering upon those kind of incremental progress steps to deliver those outcomes as required by the regulator and by BEIS. And a number of, so the common framework is complemented as well by the DNO business plans and other innovation projects. And this will help us inform that kind of strategic roadmap for flexibility. So you kind of got an immediate view of what we're doing and a sort of future looking view of how that will be changing out to the future as well. So the common framework for flexibility is just a lens for explaining the different work activities and and how they help support and deliver some of the key aims and objectives set out by Ofgem and BEIS. And it's very much tied into delivering the overarching government directive of that kind of net zero mandate, but then discharging that through a lens that is focused around 3 main key functions that are recognised as being distribution system operator functions within the Ofgem baseline role. So that is the planning and network development, the market development, and the network operation. And within those 3 sort of pillars, we've got a number of key areas, and these key areas can be readily identified back to the whole of the Open Networks programme. So looking across forecasting and optioneering and whole systems planning, looking at flexibility services, market coordination, market platform, emerging market to market governance, and then finally under the network operation, looking at service dispatch, visibility, network management systems, and system interoperability. So a number of these, so the whole point of the common framework for flexibility is that we're going to be pulling these things together and using this as a lens so that we can easily explain how the work packages that we're delivering within open networks are delivering upon government and regulatory ambition. And so what we also want to do is take that overarching higher level view of things and build it down into a bit more of a time-bound work programme. So this is the idea of the P0, and what we're working through at the moment it is to try and take each of the different key areas that were explained in the previous slide and highlight a number of key deliverables and focus in on exactly when those deliverables will be both improved, developed, implemented, and then sort of developed as business as usual as part of the network operator developments. So this should really guide how the networks are prioritising a number of these, and hopefully this should give some reflections back to the market and to stakeholders as to where we see our current focus priorities, which are the areas that we're really keen to make some some bold changes and implement them across our operations, and how our stakeholders can use that to inform their operations as well. So the roadmap isn't specific to any to just to open networks or any individual company. It has a much wider kind of role to be playing that across the whole of industry, and as much of not just open networks that feeds into this, but also the regulatory ambition, the key requirements from our from government, and also how the other wider innovation programs are also feeding into this and help supporting the rollout and delivery of some of these aims and objectives. So in terms of what we're looking at for the consultation, there are a number of questions that we're looking to seek sort of feedback on. So we'd really appreciate if any of these particularly you have a strong feeling or have got a particular viewpoint that you'd like to express associated with these. We'd really like to understand if this high-level framework and the way that we're developing the underlying explanatory strategic roadmap, is that useful to your business? Would that help inform how you're doing things and how you expect to see the industry developing? Is that lens really useful, and how could we better put it to use? Is there any elements of it that we think could be improved, and could that framework and roadmap help support your business or your particular remit? If there's any sort of changes that you think might make that a better fit, please let us know. We're also keen to go and get some feedback about some of our KPIs and metrics that we already report, such as the flexibility figures. We publish those on the ENA website. Does that understand the growing emergence of the flexibility market, and do you use that information to try and look into your pipeline of flexibility work out into the future? And then finally, is there anything that you'd like to see the industry support through open networks to facilitate moving to more liquid and developed coordinated local markets? So is there a particular element of that you would like to see acted upon through open networks? Please give us some ideas, and we can sort of take this forward. Excellent. So the next deep dive that we've got is on some of our flexibility products, and it's with Lois. Take it away.
Hi everyone. So yeah, this is about our flexibility products. So anyone that's familiar with open networks, especially over the last few years, will know that this has been a bit of an enduring product. So it's evolved as everyone's markets have evolved over the last few years. So the products were originally defined in terms of their use cases, and that was back in 2017 or 18. And then in I think 2019, we agreed to standardize the names of them. In 2020, we then agreed a set of parameters, and then throughout 2021, some of these changed a bit further, or that they weren't really implemented, just reflecting some of the differing internal processes and regional requirements that we have, as well as some different bits of feedback from more regional stakeholders as well. So as a bit of a long story short, there were still some variances in how these different services were being operated around the country. So the work that we've done over the last kind of 6-7 months has been a kind of deeper dive gap analysis into these parameters, so why they differentiate, but then a bit of a further look into, does it matter that they differ? So we've turned them around. Instead of being the original products, which were defined very much from a network perspective, so these are the use cases about the constraints that we're seeing on our network, trying to turn them around into a bit more of a customer facing product. So how do you as stakeholders interact with these, and what do you see as the key differentiating parameters? So this leads on, if you go on to the questions, this slide instead. So the key differences that we've got here are within the secure and dynamic products, so relating to payment mechanisms, and then availability agreement periods and utilisation instructions. So these are the points in time where you actually get sent the notice of availability or sent a notice of utilisation and how quickly you have to respond. So this could be linked to the forecasting systems that are employed by different organisations, the platforms that are actually used for dispatching them, or the codes of practice that they have on kind of short-term failures of equipment and how quickly you need to respond, mixing in with control room procedures. So it does differ quite a bit internally, but from feedback that we've received before is not all of those differences really matter to a lot of our stakeholders. We just want to know, what do I need to do and when do I need to do it? So the key bits, the key questions that we're asking for as part of this consultation are, what are the key parameters for you in terms of differentiating between them? And, well, first of all, I shouldn't jump the gun. Are the 4 products easy and clear to understand? So are there products that you find easier to understand, or ones that you still can't really differentiate between? Which then leads us on to our next question of, what is the main differentiator? Is it the notice period, or is it the payment mechanic? And then leading on to our third question, so about the current divergence, do you see this as a barrier, or which of these parameters is the biggest barrier to you in terms of participating? Is it longer term availability, or only knowing at the last minute whether you'll have to be utilised or not? And then lastly, it's whether you have a view on whether we should create new products where we have gaps. So where we've noticed that we do have some of those differences, so especially between sustain and dynamic, is it, instead of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, should we just create a new round product that will make that round, that will fit that a lot better? So that is up to you all, really. We don't want to, if things aren't currently easy to understand, we don't want to continue to make things even more complicated that people won't understand more in the future. So that is a summary of product 6 so far.
Excellent, thanks, Lois. So now we've got a section in the agenda to throw it open to some to our stakeholders to if they've got any particular questions on the previous 2 deep dives that we've had. So that strategic framework for flexibility and providing a bit of a understanding of the priority key focus areas through the Open Networks program, through that P0 product. If there's any sort of questions you've got around that, or indeed if you've got anything on the flexibility products and our approach to that, and how we might be working with those into the future, please do fire those questions. So if you chuck them into the chat, then we'll be able to work through those in a logical order.
So we've got a question in the chat about, are we looking for a new DSR product this winter? So currently there aren't any plans at distribution level for creating them specifically for this winter period, but there are discussions currently ongoing about services on the transmission network procured by the ESO. So we're going to be procuring all of our standard products over the winter period. So because all of our so distribution flexibility tenders are done on a biannual basis, taking updated forecasts, and they're very locational, so relating to the exact site in which that constraint is happening. And so anything that we procure this winter will be in line with any of our normal winters. Things won't change here, but there might be further constraints coming from the transmission network.
So I think we've got a question in here about in the framework there was no forecasting operation within the there was no forecasting activity within the network operation. So the slides that we shared more was about the actual framework itself and the expectation of how we see that developing, rather than the sort of finalised end product. In terms of forecasting, then we definitely would see that network operation to have an element of forecasting, but whether it needs its own separate forecasting, it's probably more likely to be a combined activity that spans both the planning and the network operation, so that it's aligned. But yeah, in terms of what we're trying to do at the moment, it's about, is this an appropriate lens? Does this make sense as to visualize it? And will this be useful as a sort of future publication, rather than agreeing that the detail in itself is correct at the moment. So I think we've got a further follow up there on the products for this winter. I think, as Lois sort of said, we're definitely keen on seeking more flexibility participation across our existing portfolio, and this is really the DNO's main flexibility requirement is around the constraint management. But I think as we're starting to see a little bit of movement on how other flights of flexibility might be able to support some of the ongoing or provide more mitigation options for some of the wider sort of system balance problems that we've got. I think we're really keen as network operators and system operators to see how they manage together, and that kind of aligns to some of the work that we've done to date on stackability. But I think what we would be really keen to do is hear from stakeholders as to what kind of barriers, or even if the prospect of participating in new markets, whether that would be a kind of whether that would be a further incentive to really open up and improve participation. So I think that's one of the hardest things that sort of facing the existing flexibility market is ensuring that the right level of participation is adhered to. So we're really keen to see that come forward. So Lois, we've got a question there on the DNOs using the same products for different issues, which is necessitating the need for different payment mechanisms. And there might be a level of confusion around there.
So currently only one of the products, so it's just the dynamic product, has got a different payment mechanism compared to other DNOs. So that was part of the I think question 4. So where some of these differences are, is it worth creating a new product so that we can achieve standardization across all of them? But there's largely quite a lot of standardization already around pricing structures in terms of whether it's an availability or a utilization payment. However, the approach to whether you're having pay as bid, pay as clear, or another pricing approach still does vary.
And I think that this is one of the balances that we're really that we're trying to manage at the moment, is that we need to try and converge, and we've successfully aligned product terms and making sure that they're embedded within all the network operators. But equally, when new events come along or innovation projects, we need to respond and perhaps have the ability to create new products that may address missing gaps in the market. So there's a different balance between keeping products converged and static and building confidence in the market, as well as enabling that kind of agility. So, hopefully we're striking the right balance at the moment of setting out existing products in a coherent way, acknowledging that there might be some differences along the way. But again, keen for views and thoughts on how we might improve or respond to some of those.
And just to add, if anyone wants any more information on the current areas of divergence and why they are the way that they are, the Product 6 paper that was published kind of alongside this consultation does provide an overview. So it's got an explanation under each product as to why those differences are there and how they came about and what that means for you as a stakeholder, really.
Excellent. Okay, I think we've reached the end of the questions that we've got now. If there are any questions, please do chuck them into the type box, or we'll move on with the next session, the deeper dives to the other elements. And if we need to step back, we've got a bit of time at the end to wrap up. So more than happy to take a few of those sorts of questions now. Questions then. So the next deep dive session is on flexibility procurement, and we're going to be having a look at the procurement processes and how some of those are converging and being run across the networks. And to do so, we've got Helen today.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Ben. So product 2, procurement processes, and the product team this year has produced sort of 2 key outputs that we're really looking for your input on through this consultation. So the first is around sort of the steps, the evolution process towards DNOs being able to perform real-time or closer to real-time procurement. So we published a paper on that in February early this year. And what we did, we kind of looked at the current procurement processes that DNOs have, and we looked at DNOs' existing future development plans where they exist. And we kind of reviewed those steps and looked across the short, medium and long term and identified, what steps need to happen, what work needs to be done in those timeframes. It's also worth noting that the P2 team will undertake some work further work in Q4 this year to sort of produce a more detailed timeline for these steps. But this consultation feedback is going to directly feed into that implementation timeline that we develop. So when we're looking at short term, so sort of the next sort of 12 months, it's really sort of around knowledge gathering and looking to where we can remove any conflicts to the operation of flexibility closer to real time and minimise any network risks. So those sort of categories fell into planning constraints, how we manage the conflicts and any risks associated with operating flexibility. So engineering recommendation P2, for example. Flexibility assessment, so the common evaluation methodology tool that's been developed through P1, how does that accommodate flexibility procurement closer to real time, and also compliance with procurement law. So a lot of network operators comply with UCR, utility contract regulations, and that doesn't really work so well with closer to real-time procurement because sort of imposed notice and standstill periods. So sort of these are sort of short-term barriers that we need to understand and overcome. And we have sort of identified that through the work that we are doing this year and P0 and P1 and P4 sort of doing work at the moment that's going to allow us to hopefully remove those barriers in the short term. And then moving on to medium term, so we've identified that timescale as sort of the next 1 to 3 years, and I think it's fair to say some DNOs are potentially already thinking about these medium term steps, but sort of categorise this as planning, and we've put that into 3 groups. So products, processes, and systems. So in terms of products, does the design of existing products need to change to accommodate close to real-time procurement? Do we need to introduce new products? With processes, what will the contractual structure look like? What will the timelines be for closer to real-time procurement? What will the decision making around availability and utilisation looked like for closer to real-time procurement. And then, you know, systems, which is quite a big category really when we're looking at systems. So that's internal systems, you know, existing system development to existing systems, or any new systems that need to be developed. Digitalisation, automation. So if we're operating closer to real time, things need to happen, you know, much quickly. Automation is really key. And if you're looking to scale up as well, you know, increase, you know, work with a larger size market, you really need that digitalisation step. And you know, the management of data, and also how we interact with other marketplaces. So you know, third-party marketplaces, or you know, whole system sort of interaction. So that, you know, how do we plan our systems to enable us to operate at that level? So again, we've identified dependencies on other open networks outputs. So you know, P2, P3, that's looking at dispatch and settlement. And P6, you know, Lois's product there around flexibility products. And then in the longer term, sort of longer term steps, we've got again 1 to 5 years. So again, recognising that some of these longer term steps do need to happen in parallel with the medium term steps, and that's really thinking about implementation. So the rate of evolution. So that will, you know, network operators will be informed by maybe the complexity of some of the elements in the medium term steps. The level of liquidity, the level of market maturity, and they may decide, you know, intraday procurement is, you know, they want to go straight and do that straight away, or they maybe stage it and do monthly or weekly or day ahead. So that sort of rate of evolution, it needs to be informed by that sort of complexity and liquidity factors. And then also sort of transparency. So, you know, how do we get this standardized market information into the market? You know, how do we make sure that the data that different network operators is putting out is consistent and available and accessible? So again, sort of dependencies on that sort of P0 overarching common framework product, and also on the existing DNO, you know, C31E off-gem reporting processes as well there. So that's it for our sort of first deliverable that we've done this year for P2. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just talk through the second. So this one is around the alignment of pre-qualification processes. So those sort of you know, the hoops, as it were, that we as network operators ask you to jump through in order to get a contract to procure flexibility, to deliver flexibility services. So again, we've published a paper around this that was published last month. It's on the ENA website. Again, we collated both the DNO and the ESO information around all of their pre-qualification criteria. So every question we ask ahead of being able to award a contract, we collated and assessed, and we found that pre-qualification falls into two broad categories, and they are technical and commercial. So technical around, you know, your assets capability, and commercial, you know, more around sort of company level qualification. We found that the volume of questions that we asked sort of varied quite significantly in some cases between organisations. So the recommendations we're putting forward really focus on alignment of those criteria and consolidation. And again, we will take some further work. We will undertake some further work in Q4 this year to produce a delivery timeline for these recommendations, which your feedback through this consultation will directly contribute to. So just to summarise sort of the high level recommendations that we've put forward. So we're recommending that standardised templates for both technical and commercial qualification criteria should be agreed in collaboration with the ESO, DNOs and wider market platforms. So really sort of a whole system approach to pre-qualification, and a sort of a one size fits all, you know, potentially a sort of standard template for pre-qualification. And then we're also recommending that we prioritise the template for the alignment of technical qualification criteria. So the information around assets, we think that this will give the greatest benefit to the market. So commercial qualification is usually done sort of upfront. It's a one-off process that's done once. and technical qualification can be done a lot more frequently. It can require changes. So if you've got a portfolio of assets that changes or grows, it's a process that is much more iterative. So we think it would be more beneficial to the market to prioritise that one ahead of the commercial qualification template. There are some quick win, low effort aspects that we've identified around commercial qualification. So consolidating that sort of level of commercial questions, and also putting a bit more transparency out around how those questions are grouped. And then lastly, we're recommending that the standardised templates be, sorry, you skipped ahead of me, so that they should be sort of marketplace agnostic, and that they're suitable for different types of accessibility. So agnostic, accessible, available through manual or digital processes. So yeah, if we just skip now to the questions. So we've got 2 questions, one around each of those milestones. And the first is, are there any key considerations for enabling D&O evolution towards real-time, close to real-time procurement that we haven't included or we haven't thought about in the paper? So is there anything in the next 12 months that we really need to think about? Have we the complexity within those medium-term considerations? Have we captured that adequately? And are there sort of long-term steps that are on the horizon that we haven't considered yet? And then question 2, we're asking if you agree with that prioritisation of technical pre-qualification, a standardised template for technical pre-qualification ahead of the commercial, and if you agree that that offers the most significant benefits to the market. So, have we correctly judged the significance of that barrier, or are there barriers that we actually haven't considered? So yeah, your feedback around those would be really, really useful. So that's it from me for P2. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Helen. And so now we're going to take a deeper dive now into the standard agreement, which is something that we're working across both ESO and DNOs, in ensuring that flexibility procurement is working to a common set of terms and conditions. So and with that, I have Andy to introduce this topic.
Hi, thanks Ben. Good afternoon all. So during 2022, the P4 product working group has been looking at aligning the schedules which will go to support the standard agreement. And what we've put out for consultation is a proposal that we will move to service-based schedules. So whether there'll be sort of like an active or reactive DNO or a response and reserve ESO structure. But what that will actually do is that it will make everything into a one-stop shop. So if you went to look for a particular service, then all of the documentation and all the contractual documentation that you need will be in one place and in a familiar format. So if you go to look at that, whether you're going across the services or across the different organisations, there'll be a very familiar look and feel to the structure of the schedules that are supporting the version 2 of the standard agreement. So on the diagram on the right hand side, you'll see here how these will feed in. So whatever the service it could be, and the beauty around this, and we're going to explain on the next slide about a bit of future proofing, will show how it's structured. So you've got the standard agreement and then the standard agreement glossary, which were done and have been published on the ENA website from last year's work stream. And on the right hand side of that, you look at how the service-based structure will have that look and feel. So it'll have a set of service terms, and within that there'll be all of the information you need, sort of technically and of how to provide a service, but equally things like how it's performance monitored, etc., in there. You have a service-based glossary. So these are the key terms which would be just for that service and would sit outside of the standard agreement glossary. An annex folder, which is service-specific documentation that you need, because there will be if you're going against, say, a response service to an active service, there'll be differences in there. And then you've got your forms and templates and your signature documents. So these are the tools you need to be able to either to bid into auctions or to actually have the contract award signatures in place in there. So they all sit into that. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. So as a P4 product works group, what we've looked at is the benefits of doing this and this proposed structure. So we're looking at the flexibility. So the way that this works now is it will allow for the differences across the organisations that are currently there regarding product design, procurement award and contract. And what I mean by that is if you're operating on a framework-based set of contracts or a tendered award contract award, the structure has the flexibility to be able to do both in those. And then looking ahead, as was mentioned earlier, it will allow organisations to move to a framework approach and a day ahead or intraday procurement approach. In terms of consistency, what it will allow there is it will have familiar naming conventions. It will have a look and feel to providers of services, to the DNOs and to the ESO. And just worth mentioning that initially, the initial step for that service structure is a lot of the current schedules that are used from under version 1.2 by the DNOs, they've been sort of realigned, so there'll be a lot of familiar clauses and language in there which you're already used to dealing with. Again, looking ahead, the whole idea behind these, one of the things we considered when we were looking at this structure was that it does really just set the foundations for closer alignment. So when the output of like the P2 and the P4 product teams, such like procurement process, service alignment design are realised, then the framework's going to be in place contractually that we'll be able to adapt these. And then again, looking ahead, as we develop new services, I think someone mentioned if we've got a circle, we build a circle-based service. It will allow us to, for a new service, to be added into the structure in a recognised format that people are already familiar with. There's one on here as well, which is not been, which I have not put on there, but it also allows us to isolate a service as well. And what I mean by that is that across the organisations, there are requirements to consult outside of the ENA process, but consult within sort of the European balancing guidelines or clean energy package, etc., which there is a consultation process which needs to be followed. And it allows that particular service just to be isolated if you're going to consult on a particular set of terms or say a service design, etc. So what we're consulting on, so if you move on to the next slide. So what we're consulting on and what we're hoping to get from yourselves is your feedback and either your approval or your recommendations of the proposal to move to service-based structures. And what I'd like to point out is that as a P4 working group, we recognise that this is purely the first step in the alignment schedules, and that sits alongside the current version 2. But we also believe it's a keystone. So as that closer alignment, etc., comes to a head, then we're in a position that the actual content of the headings within there will become closer and closer aligned. So it is purely the first step. This is not the first and final step in the process for schedule alignment in this. Happy to answer any questions in the next brief session, Ben.
Excellent, super. Did you want to go through the two consultation questions just to? Sorry,
yeah, I can.
You did go through them, didn't you?
Yeah. So we have some pretty simple questions on that. Actually, is one is do you support the move to service-based schedules? And if you don't, we'd like to understand the reasons why, so we can understand that and develop that into future work stream, or even maybe have a look at how we can maybe address this. And then the other one is to gauge, looking at our workload over the next, say, couple of years, is what other areas would you like to see the P4 product address as part of the standard agreement and supporting documents? So 2 questions out there, but ones that will help us push this through and look at our future work, help us sort of like define our future workload on that.
Excellent, thanks, Andy.
Sorry, Ben, I forgot that slide.
That's right, no problems. So I think I've already got a couple of questions in the chat, actually. If I could ask Helen to pop back on. As just a query around the CEM or CHEM tool about evaluating the most cost-effective option, and questioning about how that relates to barriers to procurement, to real-time procurement.
Yeah, so you've got a really good point, and it's I don't sit on that product, if I'm quite honest with you, and I think this has been fed in from another member of the P2 team. But looking at my notes, I think it's really just a recommendation that we've put to the CHEM product team that you know, they consider the tool's applicability to shorter term procurement timescales and look at any developments that can better support it in its evolution going forward. So yeah, you know, it's potentially not a barrier, but you could potentially better support that evolution to real-time procurement. And yeah. I think there was another question from Matthew as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think just on that point, Helen, I think my understanding is that it's about the tool being able to take in sort of time variable pricing and more different prices for different procurements into the future, rather than it's got a very simplified approach to the cost of flexibility as a kind of uniform variable. So some changes to there might better support real-time markets which are likely to have a bit more variability in the pricing across different timescales. And I think you're already picking up another question there, Helen, as well.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, product comment really about, you know, standardized templates should cover all products. And you only want to do it once, and then when you've done it once, you're then eligible to participate in, you know, other products, other networks, other markets, and that's exactly the principle that we're aiming for. So yeah, apologies if that didn't come across, but yeah, really this sort of whole system view of standardized pre-qualification templates. So as little you know, repetition as possible, and I think I called it a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach really is the ambition that we're looking for this. So yeah, exactly, hit the nail on the head there, Matthew. That's exactly what we want.
I think that idea of having similar or having identical processes for undertaking that pre-qualification could mean that one party can take the pre-qualification results from another party and use those rather than having to duplicate and run through multiple hoops, which should really help participants that span multiple markets, both for ESO and for DNO as well.
Yeah, and that answers the question that's just come through there as well. So yeah, ESO, I looked at that as well.
So yes, I think there was a question earlier on about interactions with the FSO, so looking at how DSOs are running flexibility markets for constraint management on distribution networks and how that might integrate and interact with FSO. So certainly DSOs are exactly that, looking at constraint management for distribution networks, and the ESO is looking at keeping the supply and demand in balance through the use of DER and other sort of flexibility. Those are two distinct markets at the moment, but we're making sure that the building blocks and the contractual elements of those are as closely as aligned as possible, because really we want to make sure that anything that is able to participate at a very local level, it is also able to participate at the national level, and there's no unnecessary barriers between stackability and participation across those different markets. Jolly good. I think that is dried up the questions in our chat box now, and I think we've got a few minutes for a break as well. So stretch your legs, have a cup of tea, and if we can try and get back as close to 3 o'clock as possible, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, we've had a very short 5-minute break there. And hopefully can try and reconvene now for the next session. Within this next session, we're going to be looking at operations and settlement, two activities that seem it inextricably bundled together, but clearly have lots of variances and differences between those two streams. The first session we're going to be looking at now is around dispatch interoperability. So making sure that, that the systems and data that we are using to talk to flexibility providers is convergent and standardized to help reduce those barriers to entry for different flexibility service providers. And with that, we've got Joe to introduce today's presentation.
Thanks, Ben. So I am one of the co-leads within the dispatch interoperability product. If I could have the first slide, please. So just to lay out high-level background to this particular product. This is building on previous work that was carried out in 2019 under product 3 on workstream 1A that year. And the remit this year of the product is to focus on the standardization of the dispatch and settlement processes. This has kind of been split in two because these are two quite different topics in some respects. So the first half of the year, the work we've pretty much completed and will be presenting today is being focused on alignment of dispatch processes. And as we move to the second half of the year, we're now working on settlement processes with recommendations for that coming out towards the end of the year. For the dispatch side of the product, we will be considering interoperability across various systems. So this is across DNO systems, ESO systems, and also potentially third-party platforms as well. If I could have the next slide, please. So what we found going through a process of first of all doing some gap analysis about existing dispatch processes across different DNOs and ESO is that actually there is a fair degree of general alignment between DNO as to the phases of dispatch for flexibility services. So while there is still quite a range in terms of the methods of communications used for these, the actual high-level process is generally aligned. Most DNOs or all DNOs go through some variation of phases through receiving declarations of availability, accepting the services that are required, scheduling and instructing those services to run, sometimes using a cease instruction to stop the operation of services, monitoring those services, post-action reporting, and also where necessary cancellation of dispatch. So while some of those vary a bit between DNOs and also more notably between different product types, generally every service goes through those phases or a subset of those phases. What we found, I mentioned across the different DNOs, there is variation between the communication methods that are used for this. However, there is a general consensus amongst members of the product group that APIs, application programming interfaces, will be used to manage dispatch in the long term. And this is because of the degree of automation that those will enable, which will allow fast responses and more automated responses in terms of the dispatch and management of flexibility services. But what we have noted through this is that there will also likely to be a need to maintain other methods of dispatch as a backup contingency option should API platforms fail, or also potentially for smaller flexibility service providers who perhaps do not want or are not able to justify the development work to integrate with an API. It may be that DNOs need to maintain or choose to maintain other dispatch methods in order to engage with those smaller flexibility service providers. Off the back of this, then, the main recommendations we're making at this stage is that there should be the development of a common API for dispatch that can be used across the industry. And the key priorities in terms of developing this is that we need something that is suitably flexible to accommodate potential future requirements. So this is about ensuring that the design of the API has scope and considerations such that future flexibility products that may be developed down the line can be added to the API, that the API will not become out of date and need replacement within a few years, but it should be able to cope with sort of credible additions or likely additions that we can predict happening at this point. And the other key recommendation is that we need to bring in software developers, experts on APIs to actually handle the development and the implementation of the API. and that the members or the sort of representation that's been on the existing work group so far would be overseeing the electrical and service parameters that that API needs to deliver. So it's kind of off the back of those conclusions that we're taking forward 3 questions into the consultation. So the first of these is to check our main conclusion is right, that do you agree that APIs should become the main method for system operators to dispatch flexibility services? Second question then will be, if a new dispatch API is developed for managing dispatch, how long do you think is a reasonable time frame for flexibility service providers to implement the changes required to use the new API? So this is effectively considering some service providers will have already done work with different DNOs, perhaps to integrate against their existing APIs. When a common industry-wide API is developed and starts to be deployed, how long should system operators be maintaining that option to use the old API, effectively having the option to use the old or the new API in parallel? That gives a reasonable time frame for service providers to update their systems to utilize the new API. And the final question then, we've laid out sort of what we think the long term is are there any interim steps that could help contribute to dispatch interoperability ahead of the development of a common API?
Excellent, thanks, Joe. So that was a bit of a deeper dive into the dispatch interoperability. The next session we've got is looking at an interesting topic. Is primacy. So looking at the interactions between distribution and transmission needs and ensuring that those two needs are working together as one, and towards a common rule set. So we have Matt here who's going to take you through a few slides on our approach so far.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. So for those that don't know me, I'm Matt Rivet, one of the co-leads of the P5 product this year, with my sort of counterpart, Matt Watson from WPD. So we'll just spend a couple of minutes giving you time to sort of digest a bit of the background on primacy rules, what it's all about, what we're trying to achieve. Obviously, as Ben said, this is quite a hot topic, I think, in this year's sort of work stream of products that are being delivered. But in essence, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve is a set of rules that can be sort of developed and implemented to help manage potential service conflicts between an ESO need and potential sort of DNO needs to manage their own networks. So this is building on previous work that has been undertaken as part of Open Networks, primarily another workstream 1A products in 2019. And what we're trying to do is develop rules that balance a number of different sort of criteria, both from sort of a network management perspective, but also looking at maintaining operability of the whole system, but also helping to enable and facilitate markets further in that respect. So it's obviously quite a tricky and complex topic to work our way through, but I just want to spend the next couple of slides giving you a bit of an update on where we've got to date and give you a bit of forward view as to hopefully how you can get involved with the products a little bit more if you're not already. So we just flick to the next slide, please. Super, thanks. So from an updates perspective, we've had quite a busy year within the product. We've been sort of juggling different pieces of work throughout the sort of last few months. So where we've got to date, and I sort of won't go through all these verbatim, but some of the key things we've achieved is we've developed the privacy principles, which were sort of signed off through the steering group approach, which has then led to us being able to delve into more detail around some of the use cases. So one of the key things that we did at the start of the product is develop a use case evaluation framework, which looked at effectively all of the ESO services and all of the DNO services, including things like A&M as an interaction. And what we tried to do is pull out and evaluate some of the kind of key use cases that needed to be looked at first from a rules perspective. So as part of that, we conducted the scoring exercise to prioritise those initial use cases, which I'll go over in more detail in a subsequent slide. We've now developed some of those rules for what we call iteration 1, which is effectively a collection of those use cases that I've just talked about, which we'll be looking to move forward to sort of implementation with. And all this is being driven by the sort of Bayes and Ofgem smart systems and flexibility plan, with quite a strong focus on trying to get primacy implemented consistently across GB, sort of as quickly as we can. What we've also done throughout the process is held a number of focus groups, which I'll point to again towards the end of the presentation. But again, that's your opportunity to sort of get involved with the work that we're doing. And we're very, very keen to kind of get your feedback and steer into the product work as well. We published a product report, which is available on the ENA website, which sort of details a bit more about the iteration 1 work. So do go and have a look at that if you'd like to understand a little bit more. And more recently, we've worked with consultants to actually assess the impact of the application of some of the rules where A&M is involved in the use cases. So that's one of the areas that we're obviously quite mindful as it has impacted a number of different parties. So we've tried to bring in some consultancy support to help us with that work. And we're just now starting to get to the point where we're getting some outputs from that. So again, the next focus group, which I'll point to at the end of the session, is going to be quite interesting around discussing those outputs. So in terms of how we split the work up across the sort of last few months within the product group, we've kind of split things out into 2 iterations to try and stage how these things get rolled out, because obviously trying to manage the deliverability of this is sort of half the challenge as well, given the complexity of some of the use cases involved. So the 2 sort of areas that we're taking forward through some of our delivery vehicles that are available is the new regional development programs constraint management service, and that's being compared with some of the DNO flexibility services that could potentially counteract that instruction on different assets within the same sort of geography in the distribution network. And we've also developed some subsets of some of the balancing mechanism actions that the ESO takes, which to start with cover things like constraint management, inertia instructions, and sort of voltage management. Again, where you've got the possibility for an ESO service need to effectively be counteracted by DNO flexibility needs within a same sort of geographical area as well, but on different assets. So these we felt through the scoring came out as being influenced not just by their usefulness in terms of the proportion of the different sort of instructions that would be covered, but also through our ability to sort of implement them relatively quickly through existing delivery vehicles such as the RDP and some of our business as usual processes making changes to that. Iteration 2 is being informed more by the work that I mentioned earlier with the consultants, which is looking at the store service or kind of an equivalent reserve service. I appreciate that, you know, the ESO is looking to sort of phase store out in the not too distant future, but ultimately the premise sort of still applies to some of the new reserve products. But ultimately, how does that instruction interact with those parties that are managed by A&M? It quickly became clear to us in the product that obviously dependent upon which rule you apply that we sort of generated as part of the early work, there could be some fairly big impacts on parties that were kind of on the losing end of that rule, if that makes sense. So what we wanted to do is try and put a bit more rigor around that from the consultancy analysis that we've just sort of started to conclude. And as I've noted at the bottom, that will be shared as part of our next product focus group, which I think moves us neatly onto the next slide. So what we're really keen to sort of encourage participation in the next focus group, because effectively for iteration 1 we've sort of got to the position where most of the use cases that we've considered, because of their general locational nature, tend to lend themselves to the DNO having primacy in most cases. However, there are sort of certain use cases where that might not fit in the future, but this is why we're taking the approach of trying to go through a sort of use case pair evaluation one step at a time. And I think the other thing that we've sort of said is the initial rules will be fairly basic in the data sharing that they enable, but what we want to do over time is evolve that And as has been mentioned in some of the other presentations, try and move as much of this towards automation as we can. So hopefully that decision-making process becomes a lot slicker and is built on a foundation of information that's much closer to real time as well. So that's also the goal within the product is, yes, there's a desire to get things rolled out, but equally we're mindful that we need to continue to evolve the initial sort of processes that we develop as time goes on. So there's quite a lot of things happening in parallel to allow us to do that. And like I say, the big push from me is appreciate it's relatively short notice, but we do have another focus group next Monday, kicking off at 1 o'clock. So if anybody would like to be involved in that to learn a bit more about the details of the primacy work, this is kind of why we haven't put any consultation questions in, because we'd like to have that sort of one-to-one session with you in the focus group. Please do come along. Please do sign up if you can. Myself and the other Matt are very keen to sort of hear your views on what we've come up with so far within the product and how we could shape that sort of moving forward for the rest of the year. So that's it from me. Thanks very much for listening. I think that moves us on to Q&A.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. Yes, it's like a really interesting topic, trying to look at how we manage the various different markets and ensure that we've got optimization and conflict management across a range of different local and national markets. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to put them into the chat box. I think that we've not got any. Got a couple of questions just jumping in there. So a question or comment around speed of implementation of the privacy rules and the length of time to get some of these implemented. So I guess one for you, Matt, is there indication of when these rules might be implemented, and then perhaps a view of the future work that would be required to widen out the scope of this work?
Yeah, sure. So it's a good question. Thanks, Matthew. So that's part of the reason that we've tried to split this into different iterations and take it on a use case by use case basis. So those iteration 1 use cases that I've talked about, our goal is to have those implemented effectively by the end of the financial year, in preparation for the beginning of ED2. So the sort of what that looks like is largely detailed in the report that we published towards the back end of April. But obviously we can give you a greater overview of that in the focus group if you're able to come along next week. In terms of iteration 2 work, particularly where we've sort of had input from the consultants, as ever with a lot of this sort of work, it does raise a few more questions. And I think what we're trying to do now as a product group is come up with a set of recommendations as to how we could take that forward, noting some of the points that you've raised about what that might do to implementation timescales. But equally, we're trying to strike a balance between deploying rules that are kind of as fair as they can be and deliverable from an implementation perspective, but also having suitable analysis to back up why we believe that's the rule that we should be moving forward with.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. And perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit more about what some of these rules are going to look like in practice. So the idea about how the various different parties might have visibility of some of the positions that are committed or dispatched.
Yeah, sure. So for the iteration 1 use cases, as we kind of pulled out in the slide pack, it tends to lend itself that the DNO tends to sort of take priority in most of these cases. So effectively what that means is we're trying to develop processes where if the DNOs identify there is a need for a particular service at a particular time in a given area, then that would be given priority potentially over the ESO needs for the use case pair that we have actually defined. And again, what we're trying to do here is make sure that we get the information as granularly as possible. So, potentially from one half an hour to the next, the services that are provided by different assets could potentially flip dependent upon whether the DNO need has dropped away or the ESO has an adjacent need in that sort of service window. So I think from a rules perspective, we're trying to make them flexible, but recognising the sort of limitations around what we could do as the first sort of rollout. In terms of the iteration 2 work, what the consultancy analysis is showing us at the moment is there's potentially a lot of costs associated with some of the rules that we have come up with, but what that's pointed us to is perhaps there's some feedback here into the design of some of the specific services. So for example, this is one of the things we want to pick up in the focus group. If you look at the way the store service is designed today, because availability is valued so highly, effectively that pushes the results towards a rule where you would potentially see curtailment on A&M parties. Now we recognise that there's an impact there, so we want to do some sensitivity around that analysis to effectively come up with what would happen if you change the design of the store service slightly to have shorter availability windows, for example. It seems that that's a kind of simple thing to do that could then give some credibility as to which rule we would recommend to be implemented as part of that work.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Matt. Very much showing that visibility and data exchanges are one of the sort of key enablers for a lot of this work.
Yeah, and just picking up on Maddie, I think your question there on sort of how people know what we're doing effectively. One of the key things that we are mindful of within the product is transparency. So any and all of the processes that we're agreeing, where there needs to be transparency around the decisions that are being made, the processes that are being followed to come up with, which units are required and when, so on and so forth, and when we actually determine there could be the risk of conflict as a result of applying the rule, we want to make that as transparent as possible through things like data portals and our websites as well. So very keen to make sure that this is transparent and consistent across GB.
Good. Yeah, I think providing that level of transparency, particularly where there is the potential for conflict to occur, could help some of the market participants align their availability or actions to avoid that conflict as well. So it's not just about us prioritising and deciding, it's about providing that visibility so that people can structure their responses in the appropriate way.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Jolly good. I think that has concluded the questions that we've got for those two products. So we can now jump into the next session, which is looking at the reporting and information sharing. On that, we have Simon, who's going to be talking about the carbon reporting, which is one of the new metrics that we're trying to provide a little bit more visibility on the carbon emissions impact of flexibility services. Simon.
Great, thanks, Ben. So for those people who don't know me, I'm Simon Brook. I work for Electricity North West, and I'm one of the P17 members, our product lead. Sam is on holiday and he's asked me to stand in for him. So most people are probably aware that P7 is a new product for 2022, and the expectation or the outcome for the product is that we develop a methodology for implementation from April 2023, which actually then reports in a consistent manner the carbon impact of the use of flexibility services. Ben picked up earlier that the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan was very detailed, and one of the expectations of the plan for this year was that delivery of that methodology for carbon reporting, and that's the intention of the product for this year. We've had wide support as a product team for carbon reporting, so you'll see the ESO and BEIS and Ofgem have been heavily involved in the work that we've been doing, which has been highly useful because the ESO has a methodology themselves for carbon reporting, and as most people are well aware, BEIS also are quite instrumental of ensuring that carbon reporting is consistent across government. So we have followed for the last 6 months quite a rigid process and had various milestones of delivering a scope, talking through the various bits of detail that we've gone through, so much so that we've recently, and alongside the consultation, published a proposed methodology. And I'm going to spend a bit of time this afternoon just talking you through that methodology. So next slide, please. So very simply, the product team created this, what is a cradle to grave for the impact of, or the carbon impact of flexibility services. And you can see that there is various aspects which are out of scope. And for those people who do know me, probably do know me because of my involvement with P1, which is the Common Evaluation Methodology, which is the assessment tool. And last year we implemented a carbon impact assessment under the CHEM tool. And that really represents the bit which is out of scope for V7 on the left-hand side. And if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see where the dashed lines bound the work that we've been considering for P7 for this year. You'll see that we've highlighted the 3 areas of direct, indirect, and consequential impacts. And as a product team this year, we have decided as part of the delivery for 2022 that we will create the methodology for direct and consequential, and that in 2023 that we will look at covering the an indirect methodology. So next slide, please. So what we've done is we have created formulas for each of the different types of flexibility services, and you'll see we've categorized them as very simply as generation, demand, and storage. We are, as much as possible, using standard conversion factors, and I'll run through an example of what I mean by standard conversion factors. And as part of the mechanism for the methodology, we've also proposed a consistent way of reporting the information in distribution services flexibility procurement report, which the DNOs are obliged to under license condition 31E. And that gets published in, I think it's May every year. So very simply, let me help describe what the methodology does. So we'll pick probably the easiest one to look at. If we look at demand at the top. So if we consider literally a demand response, and that's represented by the negative kilowatt hours on the left-hand side. You take the demand response calculated and you multiply that by the grid intensity at the time that demand response is provided. There is lots of work showing that a demand response sought at a particular time generally has a 100% bounce back or a lesser percent bounce back. So if you can imagine, some people will then use that electricity, like demand shifted completely to 100% another time, or they will choose only to take a small percentage of it. So on the right hand side, you see the kilowatt hours multiplied by a payback percentage, and we've got a number of standard values for that payback percentage. You just multiply that by the grid intensity, and that in essence gives you the calculation of what the carbon impact of using flexible services under a demand type scenario. The rest of them are very similar, slightly more complicated, and you can see that we use things like efficiency in the generation calculation, and also a fuel emission factor. What we've proposed as part of the proposed methodology is that we would use as much as possible all of the standard conversion factors. So examples would be like Dukes, various plant efficiency cycles. And the reason why we've proposed that is because we want to be as consistent as possible. All the DNOs or the DSOs are actually applying the methodology in a consistent manner. Next slide, please. So we have raised 5 questions. They are in front of you. They cover from very simply, are we doing the right thing as far as the reporting boundary for this year. Have we got the calculations correctly when we are as we've proposed? Are we right to use standard data sources? Are we using the right data sources, or would anyone would like to recommend some alternative data sources? Are we using grid intensity factors in the way that you would expect? Should we do something different, particularly around those ones of when we're using storage or using flexibility services from storage or demand paybacks? And then the last one is that clarification. Are we okay in our proposed methodology and the future and the split between what we're planning to do this year and what we're planning to do for future years? So that's it, very simply. Happy to take any questions, but I think it's possibly moving on to the next presentation.
Indeed it is. Thanks, Simon. Next up, we've got Avi to give a little bit of a background into the work that we've done on A&M curtailment management. Avi.
Thanks, Ben. And like Simon, I'm stepping in for the product lead who is unfortunately not available for the session. What I'll be taking you through is the work we've done on the A&M curtailment management and perhaps start with the background. So this bit of work was kicked off last year with extensive stakeholder engagement to essentially understand and develop a strategy for improving the availability of curtailment information that's passed on to the asset owners and non-asset or non-network stakeholders. So we've gone through multiple stages for this. So the first approach was we set out a questionnaire wherein we try to probe what are the key things that are being shared and perhaps how we go about doing it into individual DNOs. So then that was then translated to individual focus groups, so where we are able to investigate these specific feedback that we've received from the questionnaire in more detail. There were quite a few sessions on the focus group. We then went away, used that information to look at individual DNO approaches and have a gap analysis to say what are the current areas of divergence and convergence. And finally, another follow-up targeted workshop with few key asset owners to understand the recommendation that we're trying to develop. So broadly, we came up with the feedback that the information needs to be more granular, accurate, frequently provided, and perhaps in a common format. So we've then broken down that into three parts. That is the pre-application data, application process, and the operational bit. So next slide, please, Connor. So what we did at the end of this engagement process is we've published an implementation plan late in December 2021. Wherein we set out how we will be going about sharing this information and what process we'll be setting out to develop this common format. So as a part of this implementation plan, our work this year has been focused on delivering what we've committed to deliver in the implementation plan. And you can see these the implementation timescales there. So the first deliverable that the product team have come up with is a common methodology for the pre-application information, along with also the tracker of how we are publishing the information that we've committed. So if somebody is interested, you can probably go through the Open Network website, wherein you'll find this spreadsheet, which gives you the individual links to the DNO website where each of this data is currently being hosted. So on this instance, our essentially objective of reaching out to the stakeholders is predominantly captured in the next slide. Connor, if you can jump in. So we're trying to take a look at seeing that while we are going down the road of implementation, we are keen to understand whether. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what we've done is we are currently going down the route of following the implementation plan as committed. We are keen to understand to see if the recommendation we've put out there still the scope of that still meets your expectation, and are there any additional requirements that are there which was perhaps not captured in the implementation plan that we need to take a look at, and also try to frame that from the context of the Ofgem's final decision on the forward-looking SCR. So I think in this space we are quite keen to understand whether, in light of that decision, are there any additional tweaks or any other information that you need from a pre-application perspective. And the reason for this is currently we are developing that methodology, so we would like to use that information to help inform our recommendation that we've developed from the product team as well. So these are two questions that the product team would like to ask the external stakeholders, and I have I'm here for I think a few other minutes if there are any other questions, but I have nothing else to share beyond these two questions at the moment.
Excellent, thanks, Avi. Let's have a look through some of the questions and comments that we received back from it. I think this is related to the
Government reporting.
yeah.
So as ever, thanks for your comments, Matt. Don't disagree with what you've said, and we'll take those comments back to the working group and consider them. I think for this year we had thought about trying to get a baseline methodology in that would be easily consistent to apply. I think your point is extremely valid. It's just making sure that we can have access to the data to be able to do as you've just described.
Yeah, so one of the key requirements was to try and go and get something in as quickly as possible, so that we could populate some of the recent historical data and use that to report and trend onto out into the future, so that we have something fully representative for the ED2 forthcoming period. But yeah, definitely be looking at those comments to see what we can do to improve the granularity, particularly if there's if got particular comments around technologies or prior work that have been done that could look at providing some of these sensitivity factors. I think we'd be quite interested in understanding those, because that might take some of the heavy lifting if that's been done elsewhere. Jolly good. Okay. I think in terms of questions, we've answered that. If anyone has any sort of light bulb moments whereby just want clarification or to provide sort of further feedback, then on the beginning of our presentation, the Open Networks, energynetworks.org is our email address, and we're sort of happy to receive sort of further comments and into that. So in terms of sort of next steps, then we're also going to be running a panel session on the 24th in partnership with Business Green, and that's going to be looking at the role of flexibility driving decarbonisation. So really important one to be looking at the technology and the policies there, making sure that we're doing the right things in the right areas to help support some of this transition. We'll be circulating these slides, which will have the link as well, and a hyperlink, but feel free to go onto the Business Green website to go and explore where that session is. We're also going to be doing a online workshop for community energy representatives. So similar theme around enabling flexibility, but more targeted at those community energy schemes and that kind of ecosystem. Again, we circulate the slides with a link for registration. In terms of the consultation, then what we're looking for is people to provide responses back through that email address by the 12th of September. The consultation wrap document can be found again in one of the hyperlinks, and so what we really want to do is try and review the responses to this consultation and publish our comments back by the end of November, and then we can feed those comments and iterations and any outcomes into our following work programme. So yeah, really keen to get to hear back from you, particularly if you've got any specific points around what we've presented today, or any thoughts or feedback around flexibility in general. We'd be really keen to make sure that we feed that back into what we take forward, and make sure that those views are fully representative. Jolly good. So I think we're getting towards the end of today's session. I think that was the last slide that we've got to present on there. So just final points to push people towards responding back to the consultation, joining one of our future webinars, either through the Business Green one or the Community Energy over the next few weeks. Finally, seeking any sort of further feedback through the email address, opennetworks@energynetworks.org. But I'd like to take the time now to thank you for your attendance, and also thank some of our presenters here to giving you a bit more of a transparency and open book approach to what we do in Open Networks. And we'll be delighted to see and hear from you in some of our future webinars and presentations. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you all. Thanks, Ben. Bye. Thanks for hosting, Ben.